gonna have a cool panel, I think. We're gonna try our buses are cool. How many people here read the book Abundance? All right. How many people have heard of it? All right, so we're good. We're good. By the way, if there's one individual in this room who's done more in his lifetime to bring, and I mean this sincerely, transportation abundance to metropolitan Boston, it's Fred Salvucci, the former Secretary of Transportation. Fred knows how to do more with less and more with more. All right, so the abundance discussion, which I think has taken hold this year in a way that's really powerful, and I hope impactful, really born out of a frustration that was felt, particularly after the last election. It's like, why can't we get things done? Why can't we get high-speed rail to happen in California? Why can't we have urban transportation systems and transit systems like the ones they have in East Asia or the ones they have in Europe, right? Western Europe. What is it about the US context that's making it so hard to get things done? And so abundance seems to come out of this frustration that we have a scarcity mindset we've developed. And we have scarcity not just as a mindset, but as the outcome, the natural outcome of potentially an overly regulated environment where during the 1970s in particular, you had a cascade of federal regulations that were very well intentioned and probably important for the moment that many people have seen abused, overly used, misused, and not as helpful in the moment as they may have been intended to be helpful back in those eras. So in the context of abundance, I want to hopefully we'll have a conversation from folks who have thought about this a lot, who make it part of their work, and who can help us find a pathway so that abundance is less of a rhetorical discussion and more of an actionable idea. And I'm going to start with the fellow to my right, David Zipper, who wrote an article about transportation abundance that I thought was really useful. And it might be good for David to maybe tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write that. The underlying question being, if abundance means we need to get out of a scarcity mindset, does that always we need more of everything? Or how do we interpret that? So.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jim. I've spent a lot of time thinking about transportation abundance this year. A whole series of articles in Bloomberg about what it might mean, starting with that one you're mentioning from the spring, as well as I talked about a bunch of times on the podcast I do with Wes Marshall called Look Both Ways. And I focused on it, I think, in part because, or largely because, I feel like it's sort of a muddled idea when applied to transportation if we're not careful. I think abundance makes a lot of sense and it's very intuitive in some other fields like housing. Like we need more housing in the most productive parts of the country where it's really expensive and hard to build, like right here in Boston. Makes total sense. But when, I've read the abundance book, when I hear people really talk about abundance, like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, articulate the vision for transportation, what usually comes up is like high-speed rail and the cost of building heavy rail stations and transit. And my concern is that, as I think people here know, that's not how the vast majority of Americans travel. They use cars. So if we're going to talk about like a abundant and affordable, making it more easy and cheap to travel, people are going to, I think, intuitively think about more highways and cheaper cars. And I don't think that's actually what abundant advocates want, but I wasn't sure what the sort of framework was, other than to say, well, we like transit and we don't like cars. So I wrote this article in the spring to try to say, well, can we try to create a framework here to like sort of conceptualize what does abundance really mean for transportation, which I think requires some more nuance than it might in other fields. And what I really came out with, and I won't repeat the whole article, was to basically say that I think that for abundance to make sense in transportation, you have to take into account externalities. Externalities are not just things that slow down construction like CEQA and NEPA. They are negative effects or positive effects from how we move that this country, the United States, has done a terrible job of acknowledging, particularly negative externalities from cars, like congestion and pollution, safety, and all of that. We need ways to address it, and that's why things like congestion pricing, I think, are brilliant approaches that might lead to less being built because we drive less if it's implemented, but that actually could be something that would be really beneficial overall. That's why I articulated this idea of collective abundance, which I think is really useful. I know we'll be talking about abundance in the framework of transit here, but I really would encourage all of us to think about abundance for the transportation system writ large in this country, because frankly, we have to acknowledge the unaddressed externalities of cars.
Would you say abundance could mean more access for more people in a low externality way? That's a mouthful of words, but.
I mean, sure. I guess I just wonder if the average American's going to know what you're talking about.
Probably not. So how would you say that in a way that was more accessible?
Well, I think first we have to help Americans understand what access means. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I do, and it's a great framework. But let's first communicate that. Say, don't you want to be able to easily get to the places you want to go to, whenever you want to go, and then we can talk about like expanding on that. But for the time being, I frankly wrote that first article really as a warning, being like, guys, we can't just be talking about, if we believe in abundance, and I like abundance, to just say, let's just have more of everything, open the spigot for more, because we could end up actually worse off, in my view, than we started if that gets translated, as, by the way, like Sean Duffy's already done, talking about how we need to get rid of CAFE, the fuel economy standards, because they make cars too expensive for the average American. He didn't use the term abundance, but that's abundance-like thinking that I don't like, and I think most people in this room won't like either.
Well, Jim, can I jump in for a second? Just because I'm a politician, so I have to try to explain these kind of things in digestible 30-second frames. And the way I would say it is the average person only wants to commute 30 minutes in any given direction. Marchetti's constant, right? So I say to folks, you only want to commute 30 minutes one way. Abundance for transit and for transportation to me is we want as many jobs as possible within that 30-minute envelope. And whether that means it's better transit, whether that means it's more walkability, whether that means it's micromobility, that's sort of a jurisdictionally specific set of interventions. But the goal is more jobs within a 30-minute envelope.
Thank you, Congressman. For those who don't know, that's Congressman Auchincloss from the 4th District in Massachusetts. Since you interjected, let me ask you, you've been, I think, frankly, among the delegation, a leader in Congress thinking about abundance. You co-signed a letter with a bunch of your colleagues earlier this year, calling on the folks who are going to presumably put together the next surface authorization extension to really think about some of these topics when they rewrite the bill. You talked about permitting and paperwork and sort of getting rid of what generally you'd call red tape. How is that going? How are your colleagues thinking about this issue? Are you finding yourself, are they aligned with your thinking, or do you think that...
Jim, I am such an outlier in Congress on the question of transportation. I can't even I know my colleagues are not aligned with me because my point of view is basically we should get the federal government almost entirely out of the business of roads and highways and entirely devolve those decisions down to states and localities. And the Department of Transportation should be basically airports and some transit subsidies. Mm-hmm. So no, that's not where the other members of Congress are at, because I've gotten to a point where I think we just are so massively subsidizing car-centric infrastructure in this country that the federal government is the problem, not the solution.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to come back to you. I want to turn to Samatha Silverberg. Samatha, you've worked at the T and most recently at the White House during the Biden administration. You're making your current work at the Kennedy School focused on abundance. And I want to tie in the conversation that Stephanie brought to the table earlier, which is one of organizational capacity and the importance of that. Given your experience at the T, given your experience at the White House in trying to get, to put it in plain terms, trying to get stuff done, How do you view this capacity issue, and do you have solutions that you can offer, ideas for solutions?
Well, I'll say the two ideas that really resonated with me in reading Abundance and thinking about transit is first this idea that scarcity is a choice, right? We have chosen as a society, not in my view, I think in our view, to adequately value transit. And what that means is that we are starving our transit agencies. They need sufficient revenue to not only dig out of their massive backlogs, to build internal capacity, many of the topics that Stephanie spoke about, and then to innovate and expand in the places where it makes sense. The austerity mindset does not work. You can't cut your way to better service. Many of us have seen that. And we have to avoid the death spiral that David has written about and many folks are tracking very closely. Joe Biden, my boss, used to often say that public investment in infrastructure has declined as a share of GDP over the last several decades. Somewhere along the way, we stopped investing in these really critical public goods. And a budget is a statement of your values, right? President used to say, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. And so I think first is really thinking about resources, which one of my criticisms perhaps of Ezra and Derek is that I don't think they adequately grappled with the trade-offs that exist in any kind of budgetary environment, but also know that it doesn't have to be that way, right? Our bill, the infrastructure bill, made a significant, but albeit pretty modest additional investment in transit. And that additional investment almost killed the bill many times over. One of the areas of hope that I'm seeing are some of the communities that are standing up and choosing to value and resource their transit. And so you're seeing ballot initiatives all over the country, particularly in the last couple of years, which I see as a real ray of kind of sunlight when you think about abundant transit. LA, Measure M is building out this massive expansion in LA. You see this in the Puget Sound area, in Seattle. Nashville, Choose How You Move, Columbus, and then just last week, the Charlotte area passed a $20 billion ballot measure, which is for a combination of road and rail and bus. But you see these communities really stepping up and saying, we value transit and we want to resource it. But that's not enough. You have to show that transit is a good investment. And to do that, we really need to rethink the status quo, right? This is where all the elements of state capacity come into play. John showed early in the presentation the chart from the Transit Cost Project that building rail infrastructure in the US is among the highest, if not actually the highest in the world. The Second Avenue subway project was 8 to 12 times more expensive than comparable projects in other parts of the world. It's not a full apples to apples comparison, but it's still indicative that we have a very serious problem, that it costs too much and it just takes too long to build in the US. And so, why is that? It's everything from political meddling to inefficient procurement. It goes back to these issues around inconsistent funding. One big area is insufficient internal capacity. So again, what we heard earlier. One of the researchers I like to cite pretty frequently is my friend Zach Lisko at Yale Law School, who recently put out a study about how experienced engineers in state DOTs actually save money as we've seen resources and staffing in state DOTs decline over time. Project costs have increased. He's shown that when you have one additional experienced engineer on a project, you can save about $750,000 a year. So that's one solution, right? We need really good people, experienced people in DOTs, in agencies, and also paid to retain them as well. Procurement is another huge area here. APTA data shows that $51 billion, or 57% of transit costs, are procured. That's money that agencies are either putting out through their capital budgets or they're contracting with operators like VIA and others. And so these are, kind of sleepy back office functions that folks don't think about as strategic resources for driving change. And then the last thing I'll mention is, tech and AI. I love what Kristen said earlier. There's amazing ideas here, but are those tools that are really being provided in the best possible way for the frontline users? And then again, last thing is just to resource and support and empower the public servants who are making these decisions and executing towards better outcomes.
Thanks. You just helped me make a segue to Mark, who's the let's talk about tech. You're the Senior Director of Strategy and Policy in the nation's capital for WMATA.
He's your public servant executing on outcomes.
And, you know, WMATA has had a lot of good press recently about a standout transit agency that has recovered from the pandemic in a way that many people who are transit observers or transit geeks have looked at with admiration. I mean, I think you're getting a lot of attention as a system that's really attracting riders back, making people feel more optimistic about urban public transportation. Talk a little bit about that from your perspective, and also in the world that you specifically work in, this sort of strategy and policy. How are you grappling with the need to accelerate more transit in the nation's capital?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. The concept I really like is usefulness, and at Metro we've hung a lot on this topic we were just talking about of destination access, of how do you maximize how many destinations people can get to in a certain amount of time. So in a 30-minute trip, how many jobs or other destinations can people access by taking a train or bus, inclusive of the walk time? And ultimately, if you want to attract riders, you have to give the riders what they want. And riders are pretty consistent about this. They want transit to be safe. They want transit to be useful, fast, frequent. And on safety, we've had a pretty significant problem a few years ago in Washington. And when riders talk about safety, they talk about both, they're concerned about serious crime, but they're also concerned about disorder. And fare evasion is a big problem that transit agencies have to take seriously, because not only do riders really dislike it, they resent it, but they also, it creates this impression of disorder. And so that was a big focus. If riders are going to consider the service on the merits, we have to get control of this problem and make a lot of progress. And so we did actually spent a significant amount of money retrofitting fare gates, hiring private security to supplement our own Metro Transit police. And we're able to make a big improvement in those numbers, brought down fare evasion 70%, serious crime is at an 8-year low, and we've actually knocked safety as a concern down the list. And now riders, I think, are giving a chance to the service frequency. And in terms of usefulness, really focus on two things, frequency and speed. And there's a lot of debate about what is good frequency in transit. And sometimes you hear 15 minutes, but if you talk to riders, they say 15 minutes actually is not good. We're going to consider other options. And you really want to get down to 5 to 6 minutes. And so we've been trying to maximize how much service we can run that's at this kind of frequency that really makes it possible for people to not only just ride one line, but transfer. And that has been driving a lot of success. And on the speed side, it's been easier to do on the rail side, because Metro was really designed to be a rapid system, compete with cars. And so we restored 75-mile-an-hour operation earlier this year and semi-automatic operation. On bus, we've had less success so far really driving big improvements in the top line speed numbers, but have focused on consolidating bus stops, getting transit signal priority, but a lot more work to do there.
Great. I want to, Congressman, we seem to be living in a sort of hyper-polarized political environment. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know. But I see you in particular as someone who seems more able than others to sort of bridge gaps. And I wonder whether you think is there a realistic opportunity to have some bipartisan consensus around both the need for transportation abundance generally, and more specifically for transit-oriented abundance, whether that's intercity rail. Maybe let's keep California high-speed rail off to the side, because that's a little bit sui generis, but intercity rail, urban transit systems, we know that they're in red states as well as blue states. What's your judgment about the ability to develop that bipartisan approach, if there is one, and how can people in this room be helpful to folks like you as you try to achieve that goal?
You're right that there is bipartisan momentum behind permitting reform, broadly speaking. I'm a member of the Build America Caucus, which is really dedicated to these efforts, but the focus is much more on housing and energy right now than it is on transportation. I would argue that the actual unlock for transit in this country is not left-right compromise in Congress. It is devolution from the FHA to the states. Because the problem is, let's presume that we've got a lot more marks out there in the world who are going to make transit really work at the local level. The problem is it's an unfair fight because they're up against car-centric infrastructure that is radically subsidized at the federal level. And it's subsidized because of a lot of reasons, but the fundamental reason is because the Senate is so disproportionately representative of rural areas that highways are going to have, there's two things that you can always count on in Congress of being very well represented: highways and hospitals. Promise you. Both of them are going to have a big voice. And so it is not going to work. And a left-right compromise that you're going to find is probably going to be closer to the bipartisan infrastructure law, which I voted for and was a good law, than it was to the INVEST Act, which was the House-passed version. And the INVEST Act was a big swing for walkability and for transit. What happened is the Senate got a hold of it and was like, yeah, no, we're going to do car-centric infrastructure again. And that's what it's going to look like for the next several decades. We got to push this to the states and the cities.
And some of that, if I may, budget geek for a minute, a lot of that comes back to the fact that the resources for both highway and transit at the federal level come from the Highway Trust Fund. So that's coming from your gas taxes, some excise taxes, which over time have declined significantly in purchasing power because they're not indexed to inflation. So there's always been this grand bargain around the Highway Trust Fund money that it's roughly 80% highways, 20% transit. Again, when we tried to flip that even a little bit, there was, mass chaos, right? So to the Congressman's point, the only thing that I think will change things at the federal level is just a massive rework of revenue.
Yeah.
Perhaps because the Highway Trust Fund is so obsolete at this point.
Folks like me and Fred, I know, had been trying during the discussions in 2021 to get Congress to maybe think of going back to the pre-Reagan days when the federal government subsidized roughly 20% of urban transit operating costs. That didn't happen. And we've seen now in post-pandemic, when the federal relief money is gone, most agencies are facing operation shortfalls. Many of them have succeeded in getting past that. Others are still out there sort of struggling with it, and it's a real issue. David, you see a lot of this stuff because you're connected to so many groups and advocacy groups. How do you assess this?
Yeah, well, it's funny, actually. Congressman, we spoke years ago, I don't know if you remember it, for a story I was doing about how to break the highway industrial complex. And one of the things we talked about, which I was curious, because you and Samantha made me think about it, was the opportunity to, the sort of like the second order opportunities that could be created if states were more empowered to toll federal highways, because and you could actually see that linking up with abundance, because if right now the highways feel free to a lot of drivers, although they're not, tolls make it feel like, oh, it's my money, and that might actually create more pressure on states to spend money carefully, which could be constructive. It's interesting. This, by the way, tolls are something that are all over Project 2025's transportation chapter, because they love privatization. I like tolls for other reasons, but I'm actually curious, Congressman, if you feel like that's something that would actually be a sort of interesting, potentially bipartisan way of nudging us toward an abundancy way of thinking.
100%. I wrote a whole op-ed for Strong Towns about this exact idea.
Oh, yeah?
Cut the strings, cut the red tape, cut the money, and just say to the states, there's no need to have this be a national program. You run your own mobility programs, and we will subsidize. Airports, seaports are different; those are national priorities. But in general, let the states run their transportation.
I think self-reliance actually is a really interesting way to think about what the future might look like. And since we're the home state of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote the essay Self-Reliance, maybe.
Well, there you go. But it's also important. It's really useful for individual consumers and citizens to feel like they are paying for their infrastructure, because I think that creates a sense of ownership that could I think, create more of a impetus to spend those dollars carefully. Because right now, and this is something you mentioned Zach Axelrod, Samantha. Zach Lisko, our friend. Sorry, Zach Axelrod, somebody else. Zach Lisko is the Yale professor who writes about highways and how to make state DOTs more efficient. And I interviewed him about his research recently for another Bloomberg thing. And I said to him, do you worry that we're so beholden to the highway industry in this country that if we actually save money by being more efficient with building highways, we're not going to suddenly give money back to the taxpayer or build transit. We're just going to spend more money building highways. And he was like, that's not, I don't have an opinion on that. Because he's an economist. But I really do worry about that.
One other idea that I want to just plug here is Chris Calori, who now runs New Jersey Transit and had previously run the Gateway Corporation, put out a plan maybe 3 weeks ago that was all about non-tax revenue options for New Jersey Transit that included a lot of real estate related value capture. So you could think of transit agencies in other parts of the world that pair their operations with real estate development. And New Jersey Transit, for example, has land that can be industrial warehousing. They have land that could be transit-oriented development. Many agencies need legislative unlocks to be able to do that kind of work. Again, at the state and local level, this is less of a federal thing, although we did try to do things through TIFI and RIF to make it easier to get low interest financing for TOD. But when we're thinking about revenue, yes, there are user fees and there's the user pays model and thinking about that, but it's also about, again, how do we empower our transit agencies to be masters of their destiny a bit more so that they do have the revenue needed to run abundant service.
Mark, what do you when you hear all this and you think about what the potential is for devolution, and I think WMATA being Washington D.C. system, maybe the funding structure is a little bit, let's say, unique from most other transit agencies, but you still rely heavily on fares, obviously. How are you guys thinking about the future when it comes to revenue and what your needs are and what you'd like to do if there was a more abundance-oriented approach to funding transit?
Transit agencies need the most is stability of funding, because there's a lot of different models that can work. In Washington, we have a somewhat wild model where we're governed by a combination of DC, Maryland, Virginia, and the federal government, and yet somehow it's worked relatively well, even though it doesn't sound like a simple model. And the pandemic's been really rough on transit agencies. They've taken it on both ends, hurt ridership, but also on the back end, transit agencies are really exposed to inflation because it's so labor intensive. So at costs soaring really high, and that's where you get the fiscal cliff conversation. And in Washington, we're fortunate to, as a region, peer over the fiscal cliff and decide to come back from it with more funding to shore it up, combined with some cost decreases that mostly didn't affect service. But a lot of other parts of the country still haven't been able to solve that. And I think that if we're able to shore up and re-baseline some of this funding and create stability, then there is a big opportunity for growth, because the death spiral dynamic is very real, and because transit agencies have so many high fixed costs from long-term assets, you have to cut a lot to close a budget gap, and that just worsens ridership. But if you can get the wheel turning the other way and you're able to find efficiencies, more revenue, reinvest in service, it makes the network more valuable. And then there's an even longer term version of concentrating more jobs and housing around transit, which again makes, and if we get the zoning right, we can really do that, and that makes the network again more valuable, and it feeds itself. So, but the fundamental requirement is stability and predictability, because if you're making long-term 15, 20-year decisions, it can't be bouncing up and down.
Congressman, how do you, you hear that and then you think about, again, I go back to how do you get people from across 50 states to come together and think about public transportation, which I think many people either don't fully understand, particularly depending on where they're from, or don't appreciate the importance of public transportation, the important role it plays in local economies and regional economies, and the kinds of positive externalities that if they just knew about them, they might want to support public transportation more. I go back to how can folks in this room, researchers or others, be allies of folks like you in Congress to begin to shift the dialogue so that we might have a better shot at making the case for transit abundance? Is there a pathway that you can see?
Well, I mean, I think one is helping to better quantify what it means to be connected within a 30-minute, I mean, exactly what you were saying about usefulness, Mark. I think a crisper way of what I was trying to say about number of jobs within a 30-minute commute envelope, but quantifying that so you can actually look across different congressional districts or different commuter networks. How are we doing state by state? Because that is something that members of Congress are very keyed in to the daily experience of their constituents. And if you say to them, hey, there is X number of jobs within this 30-minute commute versus X number of jobs over here, and here are the reasons why, that matters, actually. People want to know that. Number two is just support for the kinds of public-private partnerships that can make things work. Particularly, I think it's going to be particularly relevant in the Southwest. You're seeing this huge growth, I would argue somewhat maybe potentially unsustainable growth in some southwestern metropolises, and they don't have very good transit infrastructure at all. I don't think they're going to build from scratch entirely public transit infrastructure. I think they're going to be pairing, whether it's city-to-city passenger lines like Brightline, or whether it's more micro like VIA. They're going to need a lot of help from the private sector, and I think leaning into that and not treating it as a four-letter word as sometimes the Democratic Party can, I think is helpful.
I think public transit needs a couple of things. There's one thing I'm sort of intrigued by these days, which is the potential for the bus. The bus is a much more, by definition, potentially agile mobility tool than a subway, which is on a rail and it goes one place to another, right? But a bus could be demand responsive. A bus could move off a fixed route. You'd have to think really carefully and really hard about what that meant and what it cost and sort of cost benefit in terms of ridership. But I think particularly in this room, you mentioned public-private partnerships, new ways of thinking about that first-last mile gap, new ways of thinking about, which we still have even here in Boston, urban transit deserts, places that are challenging for people to get to a significant bus node or subway, that perhaps there are some public-private partnerships that could emerge that make sense. Everyone has to figure out what their margins are, but that support getting more people to transit who right now have a really hard time doing that. Have you thought about this, Samatha?
Yeah, so challenge for the room. I would love for one of you or many of you to build a Buy America compliant, inexpensive, standardized commodity transit vehicle. So the great city economist Ed Glazer and I wrote a paper, came out a couple months ago, about why is it so expensive to buy buses in the United States. It is extraordinarily expensive to buy buses in the United States. It's about 3 times more expensive to buy a bus here than compared to other East Asian or Western European countries, China excluded. Then it's even cheaper. So Korea, Singapore, Western Europe. Why is that? There's a number of factors, but the two is market concentration. There are really only 2 companies left that are manufacturing buses in the United States for U.S. transit agencies, 2 companies. And it's even worse than that because they're essentially a side-by-side monopoly. If you buy from one, you stick with one. If you buy from the other, you stick with the other. The other issue is hyper-customization. The way agencies buy buses are extraordinarily bespoke. So you might think a bus is a bus is a bus. That is not true. The data that my co-authors assembled, about 120,000 buses bought over the last 20 years, 70% of them were unique, unlike any other bus in the data set. And the kind of average or the median purchase was 5 units. And so there is a lot to be done, and there's an APTA task force, and there's many people who are thinking about this, but there's a lot to be done on the transit side to be more efficient. But there's also a lot to be done on the market side to offer the type of vehicle that these agencies can buy that's compliant with federal law, but also helps them buy more buses so we can run more service and provide more access for people.
Let me ask
Great idea.
David to give a reaction to that. Then I want to get DeAnna Martin in on the conversation.
I will give credit to Samantha. I thought that the memo that she and Ed and you had another co-author too, right?
Leah Bousleiman from National University of Singapore and Julia Shepard, who is a junior at Harvard College.
Yeah. I thought it was really original and useful research. And I think that, and if we're talking about like abundant public transit, if you have cheaper buses, you actually do end up, I think, with more abundant service because you're saving money that can be invested in maintenance or replenishing your older stock so that it's newer, so forth and so on. We've talked about this before. I no offense, but I think that's actually a more exciting vision for abundant transit than what you started the question with, which was first mile, last mile.
Yeah.
Because like we're old enough to remember the first mile, last
Speak for
mile
yourself.
hullabaloo. And speak for myself. Okay, I will. I'm old enough. I myself, David Zipper, am old enough to remember like a dozen years ago when there was like this big excitement about ride hail being the first mile, last mile solution for transit. Remember that? There were all these sandbox grants from FTA to that. This is going to be terrific. We're going to massively expand transit ridership. Did not work. A little bit maybe on like commuter rail in the Bay Area where parking is really expensive in the central city. I like more than 19 out of every 20 transit rides, the first mile, last mile conveyance is your feet. If we just invest in sidewalks, I think that's a much better way of building transit ridership than chasing tech solution. All due respect to AV's microtransit, ride hail, and everything else. I feel like we always are talking about this.
You just offended half the room, but that's okay.
But hopefully not you.
DeAnna Martin is here from Seattle. She's chief of staff to King County Seattle system. There's a mic there, DeAnna. And we asked DeAnna to sort of take notes and give us some reactions from someone who deals with the day-to-day transit agency, just like Mark does. And so if you have questions or comments, now's the time.
Do you want me to stand or
You can do whatever
sit
you
or-
like. Yeah.
Hey, hi everybody, hanging on with us to the very end. I think where I started with all of you was this concept of like mobility is freedom, right? And we know this from times in our history where we've denied people mobility to enforce racial segregation, to times now where it's not just access to jobs, it's healthcare and school and all the things people go to that improves their life outcomes when they can get there with ease and comfort. And so that is kind of what we're trying to do at King County Metro. We're number 2 to WMATA and growing ridership and changing our services to connect in seamless ways for customers to get them where they want to go when they want to get there. And I think what we think about at Metro is this concept, we call it like the virtuous cycle. If we are being relevant and meeting our customers' needs with safe, clean, and reliable service, they will use it more. That using it more will mean that they, in taking those more trips, build trust and love for transit. And then they'll want to buy more of it and pay for it later when we do come to the ballot for increased revenue in the coming years. So we are, like all the transit agencies, keep pushing off the shortfall, but we're doing that by investing really in service and growing ridership and generating good public will for what it is we do so that people want to vote for it in all the ways, not just taking it, but increasing our funding. The other thing that has struck me all day today is just this notion of being human-centered and like employee and customer-driven in the decisions it is we make, and whatever tools it is we use to be able to meet people's needs. And there is still a role for the federal government, I think, in transit. We do need you. We need you around accessibility. We need you around interoperability when we're making these big investments. We cannot just do it at the local level because there are only 2 bus manufacturers. We're trying to go completely zero emissions at King County Metro. That's even harder to invest in. It's huge infrastructure. You invest in a software if it doesn't work with your hardware, and new companies come into the market all the time. We have to be able to interchange those things and adapt over time, and that's where we need federal government to help. We also still depend on a lot of federal dollars to buy those things and make sure they work and bring them to scale, which we couldn't do just locally, right? So don't leave us just yet. We need you for those reasons. In Washington, we, a couple years ago, voted, or our state legislature decided to make transit free for youth. And they give us funding to supplement the fare loss as a result of that. We also, I heard about how their partnership with schools is making a difference. There's a person here today. We don't have school buses in Seattle. We partner and give transit passes to schools in Seattle. So young people take public transit to get to school, and it gives them freedom to go a lot of other places, but it's creating a future generation of people comfortable using transit that will continue to, I think, reap those rewards and provide that mobility is freedom to more people in the future. So those are just some of the thoughts I have.
Thank you, DeAnna. That was very, very helpful. We're almost at time, and I want to just close this. I think from a person who is, transit is a very sort of important part of my life, and then a important part of what I do here at MIT, what I teach and what we research. I do worry that we're living in a time when it's hard to get, agreement on even the simpler things, let alone maybe more complicated things. Transit should be simple. Maybe it is more complicated than not. But overall, I feel like we're living in a time when what we need is hope. And hope not in a superficial way, but hope that it's still useful for people to have these discussions. Hope that we still have agency to change things and to improve things. And I wonder if I could ask the congressman who's in the middle of this stuff all the time to either affirm or not my view that we still need to find reasons to be optimistic. I mean, we still need to find pathways that's realistic hope that we can make change and that we can improve not just the way we fund public transit, but the way we think about cities and the way we think about their importance to the American way of life. Do you have a sort of closing message for us that we could take with us?
Yeah, no pressure, Jim. Thanks. I'm deeply optimistic. I've spent 10 years working on transportation policy, first at the local level and now at the federal level. And whether it's on transportation or housing policy, whether it's on the broader hot button subjects of the day, if you log off of social media, if you tune out the cable news, 2/3 of Americans are right between the 40-yard lines on most issues. And there is a deep reservoir of common sense and decency in this electorate, and it's incumbent upon elected officials to tap into that deep well as opposed to chasing the latest algorithmic outrage, and I'm confident we can do that.
Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody. I hope this was useful.
Okay, thanks, everyone.